So this week, I'm just going to basically give you guys a bit of theory behind communication strategy. Um, some stuff for you guys to think about as we go forward. Now we're going to start going into developing a communication strategy. So basically what we're going to do in a nutshell, this is towards the end, and we're going to basically determine what our communication strategy currently is, what it should be, and then develop a means to go from our current state to our desired state. So hopefully this information here, just a lot of it's probably going to be theory. I've tried to cut down a lot of the theory down so it's quick and painless. But if after you listen to this, if you have any questions, I can send you some stuff. I've written a few papers on this stuff, and I've got a lot of references I can send you. So feel free. If you are the kind of person that likes to read, instead of listening to someone like me chat, let me know, and I could inundate you with information. So basically, we're just going to talk about the key concepts of communication. I'm going to discuss social distance. This is a direct result of communication that affects the relationships amongst teams like ours. And this is just something for you guys to consider, because when most people deal with communication strategy, they always think about being able to convey information, make sure that people get all the information that they need. But there's a social element of communication that's very important, and it gets ignored quite often. And I think it's something that we need to consider when we go forward. The fact that communication is used, especially amongst distant teams like ours, as a way to develop relationships, and as a result, it affects the culture of the team. So. And as we go forward, if you guys are interested in going down this road, I've got some ideas, and then we can always scour the group for ideas. So the first thing I'm going to cover, this is a general human communication model. People usually learn this when they're in college. It's very simple. You've got the transmitter. Let me get my drawing tool out. Guy who transmits. The guy who talks. Guy who receives. And obviously the transmitter does three functions. He codes a message, what he wants to convey. He enciphers it by trying to understand how the other person is going to receive the message. So this involves, the coding involves a shared language, and ciphering involves a shared context. You have to understand how the other person will perceive your message. And then once that's all done, it's compressed into like a verbal language or a written language. There's an old saying that you know more than you could say, and you can say more than you can write. So every time that you move down that hierarchy, you always strip out a little bit of context every time. So compression is the art of creating the final message that is conveyed. Obviously, as you compress it, you lose some information. And then, of course, the receiver does just the opposite. It receives the message, decompresses it by basically trying to understand what the person's trying to say, deciphers it using the context as they perceive the person who is communicating to you use to create the message. And then, of course, it's decoded by understanding like language. Okay. And an important thing to understand is coding and decoding is a natural function. It's a cognitive process that deals with how our minds deal with patterns. It's kind of outside the scope of this, but just realize that this occurs automatically regardless of who it is, whether you're, even like when you talk to your dog does decoding of a sort based upon the information that it receives from you. So you have a channel, obviously, either it's written, verbal or nonverbal, and you have the noise, which is what affects the signal. And what is usually kept out of most models when you talk about this is a thing called meta-communication elements. And what meta-communication is are the unwritten and unseen parts of communication. Like, for instance, Larry and I, sorry, Larry, I'm going to use you in this. We talk about You know, we both have a lot of shared context. We both used to be on aircraft carriers. We've worked in Navy squadrons. So we can talk about certain things. And because we have a certain level of shared context, we don't have to communicate things that we have a shared experience with. So these are things that are outside of normal communication that is very important for communication to occur because, like I tell people, communication is what the listener does. And if the listener does not understand the context that you're speaking in, then there's going to be some value lost in the communication. And this is especially true when you deal with distant teams such as ours. And that's when we get into things like social distance that I'm going to go into in a minute. So now there's a cybernetic model. And when we go from person to person to social systems like organizations, like teams, you have a different paradigm that occurs when a message occurs. And in this model, I'm going to use manager and subordinate. So what happens is when a manager talks to a subordinate, the message becomes amplified due to the position of the manager. So anything that the subordinate listens from the manager is amplified. And when we say it's amplified, what it means is the perceived context that the subordinate understands the message from is amplified. So this is very important because let's say that the manager and the subordinate do not have a very strong shared context. What happens is if that shared context is weak and the subordinate has a negative perception of the context of the manager's message, that negativity is amplified in the message as the subordinate receives it. So at that point, your subordinate takes your message, does what he needs to do, and then hopefully there's some message feedback for the manager to understand how the message was received. Unfortunately, there's two things that happens with the message feedback. One, some managers don't do it. And it's not because managers are horrible, it's because managers, we have a system in place where most of the communication in most groups is one way. Or it's two-way, but it's like verbal one way, and then there's a report sent back. So the message feedback is going to reflect what the subordinate expects the manager to receive in return. And this is important because if there's a negative shared context, the subordinate is going to strip away as much context as possible so as to give the manager the most likely message that he wants. Now, if there's a high shared context, then the feedback is rich because the subordinate better understands what the manager expects. Then, of course, the manager compares the feedback to expected results and changes the message, and you have this ongoing feedback loop. So this is a very common model when you deal with cybernetic systems and in social systems communication in general. So this is used to explain why when a manager says something, he has, like I hear all the time, manager says, I have people that always say yes to me. I don't have people who actually tell me what I want to hear. And I say, well, it is because of the system that you have created. And it's not created on purpose. My experience working with managers and studying teams is that it's a result of the relationships that are created within the system. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. So just keep this in mind as we go forward when we start to think about how we're going to evolve our team's communication strategy. Now, the communication media model. This is a very general model. And basically, you've got your communication has two types of information that's conveyed between people. You have the codified part, the stuff that, like right now, I am codifying what I'm thinking and I'm saying it over the internet. That's codified. Then you have contextual information, which is stuff that isn't communicated, more of that meta communication. Okay, so when we look at the contextual information, The contextual information is very important within teams because contextual information is what relationships are built upon. Contextual information provides a level of trust between people. It also allows people to identify with other people. And this is something that we learned back when we were cavemen. This is our tribal instincts that we learned when we were trying to survive the saber-toothed tigers and the woolly mammoths, and allowed us to survive. And we still think very much that way. So codified information is great. It's high in detail. But like, for instance, email is very good in codified information, but email strips away a lot of context. Okay, so sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes you want a communication medium that's high in detail, that's highly codified. But when you deal with social factors, you want to use more of a contextual message. Okay, so when we look at the communication mediums that we're going to select for our communications within our teams, when we determine what we're going to communicate, we have to determine the level of context that is needed. Now, one thing that is not shown here is a thing called requisite communication. And basically what this means is there's a certain level of communication that a person is comfortable with. Have you ever had a time when a person like me droned on and on and on and you suddenly just clicked off? You probably have. I won't wait for a comment. Or when you walk in and you have 85 emails and you have people come into your office and they're asking for stuff while you're doing emails or anything else. There's a certain level of communication that is healthy and that is effective. If you go above that, what we call hypercommunication, the person begins to switch off. And this is a cognitive thing where the person suddenly starts to filter the stuff that's most important. And what is important to understand is contextual information is the easiest to process by the mind, because there's no codifying to uncodify. It's just context is easier to understand. So a person in general will strip away the codified information before it strips away the contextual information. And this goes back to our caveman days. When we were trying to survive, we used our contextual information to understand if the people that we're hunting in the pack with could be trusted. And we rely on high context cues for us to learn that. Well, we're still like that. We haven't evolved much in our strategy since then. So if we have a strategy that relies heavily on codified information, reports, emails, people will start to go and start to either delete them or ignore them. You get people with inboxes with 1,000 emails in them because either they just can't process them or they don't want to. But if a person gets high context information, it's easier to process. Now, unfortunately, high context information, it's very hard to find something that's high context and high detail, like highly codified. So sometimes you have to make a trade-off. And this is something that we're going to go through with our strategy. Does this make sense so far? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Now, there's two things that happen when we communicate. We have miscommunication. This is communication dysfunction. So miscommunication happens when the message that is sent gets garbled. In this example here, manager and subordinate 1. The manager sends a message to subordinate number 1, and subordinate number 1 misinterprets it. And then all of a sudden, when he sends the message on to subordinate 2, the miscommunication is sent to subordinate 2, and then the feedback loop, the manager goes, oh, wow, that's not what I meant. So then he either changes the message to fit subordinate 2 by clarifying with subordinate 1 the differences, or he just makes a brand new message. Once again, if there's no clear feedback loop, that doesn't occur, and you just have continual miscommunication, and subordinate 2 is continually in the dark. We see this a lot when you have people and high up flow things down, and they say, hey, this is a brand new policy. Well, people don't understand the intent or the context that the policy was created under. All we know is like, do this policy. And as it goes from the manager to subordinate 1 to subordinate 2, context gets stripped from the message until the actual context that the policy was created under no longer exists. So the subordinate does what he's told without understanding why the policy was created in the first place. And that's when you start having people who do policies that are different than what was intended. Simple miscommunication, okay? And don't forget, the messages get amplified because the manager has the ability to affect the subordinate's food, shelter, and clothing. So any misinterpretation of the message is also amplified. Key to remember. So when we create our strategy, this is something just to keep in mind as we go forward. Now, malcommunication. Hopefully we'll never have to deal with this. But what happens is, let's say the manager has a message for subordinate 1, but the message that subordinate 1 sends has a different context than that the manager is expecting. And the subordinate number 2 receives this message, and he goes, well, this isn't in my best interest. And if I follow this message's requests, it's disadvantageous to me. So I'm going to change the message, so that it shows me in a better light. So now, in this example, subordinate 1 says, hey, do X. And subordinate 2 says, well, Y is occurring. Something that's different than what is actually occurring. Well, subordinate 1 doesn't want to tell the manager bad news. So he goes, hey, manager, X is occurring. Everything's great. And subordinate 2, all subordinate 2 knows that he's saying, hey, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem. Subordinate 1 is telling the manager, there's no problem, there's no problem. This happens a lot in distant teams. I'm going to cover a thing called in-group and out-group biases later on, where teams that break down in relationships become protective, and they'll say just enough to keep the manager off their back. So they'll keep saying, yeah, X is going on, when actually Y is going on. I bring this up just to make you aware of this. So when you guys start brainstorming communication strategies, that you are cognizant of the effects of a lack of context in the messaging. You won't be able to make something that's fully contextual and high detail. All messages don't have to be that way, but just realize that in serious failures of teams to communicate, this kind of behavior is more common than not, in my experience. So keep that in mind. So this brings us to this thing called social distance. And social distance is a way of measuring relationship quality between two people, or between a person and a larger group. And basically, it's very simple. It's defined as perceived distance from another person. And what is important to understand is this is asymmetrical. Like, let's say Larry and I'm going to keep using Larry. The way that I feel about Larry may not necessarily be the way that Larry feels about me. Now, over time, they may align, but that's not just, just because I may like Larry or I may not like Larry does not mean that Larry feels the same way. So social distance, so one person can have a very high level of social distance to one person, and the other person may perceive a shorter social distance. So when we deal with relationship chains, you have to realize that they're called dyadic. You have two-way behaviors, okay? And person X's behavior is independent of person B. Okay. So social distance, you've probably seen it, like, for instance, when someone says, that person feels distant from me. Well, that's an example of high social distance. The person's not very close. The person's kind of standoffish. He doesn't communicate much. Or you may say, yeah, that guy feels very close. We feel very close. Well, that's a good example of a low social distance, because you're close. Because you feel close to someone. So low social distance is a healthy relationship between two people or two entities. High social distance is the opposite. So there are three main elements of social distance, and studies bounce back and forth. Sometimes they add a fourth one, but for the most part, most studies focus on communication, trust, and identification. Communication is probably the key part of social distance, because communication provides the quality of context for trust between two people, and it also allows information to be shared so that people have a shared identification. They identify with the larger team. And this is very important in teams such as ours, where you have people split up. Sure, we may say, yeah, we're all field engineers. We all work on system X. But when you go beyond what is on their paper as to what their jobs are they very cohesive? Do they work as a team? Obviously, when you have high social distance, the interrelationships between the team breaks down such that you just have a whole bunch of people. The famous basketball coach, John Wooten, once said that it takes 10 hands to score a basket. Well, if you have high social distance on your team, all your team members may be doing their job, but they won't be helping each other out, and as a result, they're not able to leverage the strengths of the team. So when we develop our strategy going forward, we need to be cognizant of how the communication affects these relationships within our team, both within the local team and within the person at a site and the larger team. And this is where we come into what is called a social network orbit model. And so when we deal with people who are in a foreign site, what happens is they build relationships very strongly with people that they work with. And that's natural because, as this chart would say, you've got high context, okay? So obviously, you've got a high context here, which corresponds with your local environment. And, because you have face-to-face, you guys talk all the time, you guys share pictures, there's a lot of rich detail and context. And there's also a lot of information, because if you have problems, you guys can write reports and share it and go over it. There's a lot of good feedback. Now, when you go away from your local group, you don't have as much context. So what happens is a person begins to separate the rest of the group into what is called in-group or out-group people. And you may understand what this already is without me going into detail. In-group is basically, they're on my side. Either you're with me or against me. So in-group is, in-group is, you're on my side. I can trust you. I've got, we have identification. We have high trust. And this usually occurs through, usually 9 times out of 10, these people that they communicate frequently with because they're comfortable with them, okay? So now you have the out group, which is the opposite. You're against us. And, hey, what's up, Glenn? I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and mute your camera just because it just makes it easier for the recording. Sorry, buddy. But so outgroup is the opposite. They're people that usually you have very little communication with, ones that you have a very high social distance from, people who you haven't built a relationship. with. And the nasty thing about outgroups is, if you notice here, whoops, where's my cursor just left. So if you notice here, we have what's called a majority group. Okay, whoops, I just screwed that one considerably. Hold on a minute. Let me just clear all drawings. We have the majority group here. And what happens is, in groups that have a imbalance in social distance, the in-group begins to feel like they are part of a minority group, okay? Where, you know, we're the underdogs. So all of a sudden, they're going to start sticking together. Everyone that they feel is part of a minority group, they're going to stick together because they're going to, it's part of our pack tendencies from back when we were cavemen or Neanderthals, whatever you want to call it. Now, what happens is, when you have, usually the majority group is associated with the larger group. This is usually the group that the manager is a part of. Okay, and in situations where the relationship quality is very poor, the manager becomes the majority group leader, and anyone who's part of the majority group begins to be associated with the manager. So by default, if a person is perceived as having a good relationship with the manager, and a person's in a minority group, that person will automatically become an adversary. Okay, now this is in cases when relationship quality has broken down, and this usually occurs because there's not much communication. So why do I bring this up? I'm not going to say if our team suffers from this. This is a very big question, but I want to have you guys cognizant of this so that when we start creating our plan, we need to keep this in mind, because we want to make sure, you know, there's no saying that people view the company through the manager's eyes. The key to a team's healthy relationships usually lie within the relationships between the manager and the other people, for this reason. So, and this is usually not well understood by a lot of managers. Managers have a huge effect on the motivations of the team through their communication. And it's not just like, you know, this involves site leads, leads of the larger team, you know, managers above that, managers above that. If they're perceived as part of the majority group, the person who's a member of a minority group will automatically view the others, people who are associated with that majority group, as an adversary and will act in kind. So, then this is most, I've seen a direct correlation between communication quality and motivation in this model. I don't know if, I think most of you guys participated in my dissertation survey last year. And I could tell now it was over 100 people from like 6 or 7 different programs and all over the country, all over the world. But there was a direct correlation. You know, it's very clear when a team has poor relationships due to poor communication, trust breaks down. People begin to fail to identify with others, which as a result creates mistrust and adversarial relationships within the distant teams. This is very important. As we go forward, I just want to have you guys keep this in the back of your mind as we go forward. Okay. Any questions?
Not yet.
Not yet. You're like, who's asleep? No, just kidding. Most.
Mentally
Okay.
or physically?
Hopefully just mentally, but I would forgive you for that. Okay, so this is just a quick blurb, you know, social distance, and, you know, why is it important to understand social distance when we're dealing with communication? Because communication influences trust and identification. Social distance also influences communication. It's a vicious cycle. Communication influences trust and identification, which as a result improves social distance. Improved social distance improves communication between two people. Also, the opposite can occur. Poor communication reduces trust and identification, which as a result increases social distance. Remember, high social distance is bad. And high social distance makes people want to communicate less with the other people. So over time, you have this vicious cycle, whereas social distance increases, communication decreases. And all that other stuff I mentioned earlier, like the in-group and out-group, majority group, minority group, all that stuff, it's a vicious cycle. It gets worse and worse and worse and worse until everybody hates each other. So, healthy relationships require effective communication that's high in context, requisite in quantity. We don't want to give them too much and not too little, and accurate with perceived value to the receiver. Pretty straightforward. So when we develop our strategy, this is the basic strategy design that I've used. Now, I would love to see how you guys want to do it. I'm going to basically have you guys determine how you guys want to do this. But usually what I do is identify the current state of a team's communication. It can be as simple as what I have here, what, who, why, how, and how effective is it. And in instances where you have a really poor communication relationship between entities, you can do things what's called a social network analysis, which you basically measure the level of communication between elements and the health of the relationships, and then you say, oh, this group needs more contextual information. This one may be suffering from over communication. I don't know if we need to go that far, but we can. If you guys want to just have fun and do that, we can. That's not a bad idea. So once you identify the current state, you identify the desired communication strategies. First we identify what do we need to involve in our plan. What needs to be communicated? Who needs the communication? Where's it going to? Who's the receiver? How is it best communicated, and then when should it be communicated? Okay. That's pretty simple. That's very direct design element. So, and then at that point, you design a new strategy. You identify the communication needs, identify the paths for communication, the most effective medium, identify the receiver's needs. What exactly what does the receiver need for each of the different paths? You communicate your processes, basically a communication plan, and then you identify your key social communication tactics. How are we going to develop communication that helps the team build relationships? Now, easier said than done, I understand. But in 35 minutes, I basically shotgunned about 3 years worth of information. So that being said, are there any questions? Okay. So any thoughts initially as far as this applies to our team, how we want to go forward? Wow. You guys must be asleep.
Well, I arrived late, so I'll just catch up on the back end.
No worries. Yeah, as I said, I don't know if you heard me, but I'm going to post this to YouTube, and then I will send the link out so you can watch this and look at the slides and all the pictures and stuff. In the future,
excellent. Thank you.
In the future, I need to remember to send the slides beforehand so you guys can follow ahead. But I apologize for that. So what I want you guys to think about now is between now and next week, think about all the things that I mentioned. The verbal, nonverbal, different types of communication within our team that occurs, the contextual information that we use, any problems you may see where either contextual or codified information may be either misconstrued or, I guess, malconstrued, if you want to be devious, and where we can find value in improving the way that this team communicates, such that we can both A, improve the quality of the communication, and B, help improve the relationships within this team, which in theory improves the culture of a team. Okay, so that's your homework. Okay, usually what I do when I design this with other people is I have them track their communication for 2 weeks, everything that they do. Then we make a big list of all the stuff that they communicate and how they communicate it and how often they communicate it. And we either make a communication strategy from that, or we create a time management strategy based upon how much it is, how it relates to their requisite communication level. We don't have 2 weeks. If you guys want to do it for a week, that's great. But next week, I'm basically going to open up the mic and say, okay, guys, where do you guys want to focus? And I'll bring some ideas to the table so that we don't, so it makes a lot of sense. So I know I just asked a minute ago, but if there's any questions, let me know. If you even think of something between now and next week, or if you just want more information, let me know. I can either answer it in an email, or I can send you some more information if you want more clarification on these topics that I had spoke about. Okay.
Yeah, if you have any sources that would be useful for us to get a bit more familiar with the stuff you've been talking about, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, I've got a 174-page dissertation, if you want to read that.
Is that general or?
Huh?
I would say 174 pages is not too general.
I wouldn't do that to you. I don't even want to read it. No, I've got there's a handful of references that I use that are really good at this information. Maybe I'll just send an email out tomorrow to the whole team and say, hey, here's some stuff. There's a paper that I wrote on communication dysfunction, and it talks about a lot of this. It briefly skirts around social distance, but there's some other stuff that I could send that really dives into social distance, especially as it relates to our kind of team. So I will send those. I will try to send those. If you don't see anything by tomorrow, send me an email just in case I forget, and then I will quickly throw something in an email to everybody.
Okay, and then you said you've done this kind of thing before.
Yeah, several times. Well, several, like 3 or 4 times.
Sort of like little summaries of some of those, if you have them. Sort of like the problems you saw and what actual implementations you tried to follow.
Let me see.
To address.
Okay, let me see what I can find. A couple of them I can't share, but I think I might have 1 or 2 that let me see if I can find.
I mean, even if it's like a dumbed-down version without the specifics. You know.
Yeah, what I'll do, if follows fails, between now and next week, I will take some of the notes from one of them. There's one that I did here in Dubai for a friend of mine. That what I'll do, I'll just dumb it down into some kind of Word document and try to put some like steps in place and what we did. So it'll help you understand the whole structure of all this. I know that I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you, so I don't expect a lot of it to stick. But I will see what I can do about giving you something that's tangible with like actual steps that we can do. and then hopefully that'll help.
Yeah, that would be good.
Hey, Ken, you said you were going to post this to YouTube. Are
Correct.
you going to repost the entire recording that you're doing?
I'm probably gonna post. Yeah, up to about, I may cut this end off, but the whole discussion about from slide 1 to slide 12. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Because there's like, for instance, Travis couldn't attend, and there's a few other people that couldn't attend. So, and I'll point Paul to it too, in case he wants to watch it, just so he'll understand where I'm kind of going to lead the group, because he may think that we may be wasting his time, and he's the champion, he's the boss. So I want to make sure that we address, if I'm going on a path he doesn't want to go, then I need to know now, so that we don't waste everybody's time.
Definitely.
So because I'm kind of a big picture kind of guy. If you ask me what the time is, I tell you how a watch works. And unfortunately, when people like that can get really lost in the minutia. So
In the weeds, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I really like to ask a lot of questions. Say, hey, look, this is how I'm building the watch. Is this the kind of watch you want me to build? And he's like, dude, I just want a sundial. What the fuck? So yeah. So I try to talk to Paul quite a bit, just to make sure that I'm not wasting his time or wasting you guys' time. But either way, I hope that this is even if you guys go forward and you have a long career in field engineering, hopefully this will help you guys understand how relationships occur within field engineering groups. So hopefully there's some value. So
sounds good.
Any other questions? Okay. As I said, during the week, if you have any questions, send me an email. So I will try to put together. I will try to send some references. Tell you what, I have my notepad here. I'll write this down on my notepad. So send some research papers on this stuff. Yeah, communication and social distance. I can do that. And then I will also see if I can put together what I'll do. I have an executive brief that I put together. I gotta find it, see if I still have it, on one of these things, on communication strategy. And then I will send that. I will put an executive brief together, and this shouldn't be too hard. I think I just cut and paste stuff and put something together. Some of the stuff I can't share for various reasons, but there are some of it that I can. So I will cut and paste stuff that I can and go from there. All right. If there's no more questions, thank you guys for letting me talk for 45 minutes. And let me know if you have any questions, or if there's anything I could answer, or if you have some feedback. Maybe you guys have a better way of designing a mousetrap. I am all for improvement. So let me know what you guys think, and I will talk to you guys during the week. I provided a couple models on how to understand communication. The first model talked about communication between people, and it's a model that people see all the time. You got the sender, the receiver. You got a channel, you got noise that affects a channel, which affects the quality of the message. And then I added what is called a meta communication level, which is the unspoken and unseen part of a message. It's like the context. And I use an example, like, for instance, like Larry and I, we have a lot of shared context. So when we talk, there's a lot of things that we say that is pretty much taken for granted. We don't have to talk about it. So,
it's unseen or known communication.
Right. But that level of communication occurs over time as the two people, the sender and the receiver, builds a shared identification and a shared context.
Right.
The higher the
And
shared
now,
context, huh?
okay. Well, I was going to ask, and so I just as knowledge for myself, we had finished the other project and we were going into this or transitioning into this portion of the project in a means to figure out how to communicate it with the team or how to help the team communicate better with each other and to use
That's a good question. My understanding, and this is where you guys can please correct me if I misunderstand. My understanding from Paul is that he wants to see if we can better improve communication between the sites. Okay.
And so is that completely separate from the previous project that we were just working on? Or?
Yes, this is a brand new like sub project. That the last one was a like the sub project to help with communication during projects. Okay, that makes sense. Now we're dealing with
okay.
Yeah, so disconnect this from the previous project.
Got it. Okay, that makes more sense because I was thinking, are we trying to
yeah, how does this relate to Six Sigma?
Communicate the last project?
No.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I should have made that clear early on.
No worries. And I know that I've missed time, so you know, that might have been previously covered and I just missed it.
Yeah. So the next model that I covered, and I'm actually just clicking through the slides because I'm going to record this. I'm still recording it. Is the cybernetic communication model. This is how people communicate within teams. And basically, what I said, you have a manager and a subordinate. And when a manager talks to a subordinate, their message is amplified because of their ability to influence the subordinate's food, shelter, and clothing. Okay, managers have this big sign over their head that says, "Hey, I can affect your ability to buy stuff." So the subordinate,
right, you have a power position.
Exactly. Yeah. It's exactly. This is caused by perceived power balance. And this has actually been tracked by high power cultures and low power cultures, and it's there's a direct correlation to this. So the subordinate is going to the understanding of the message is amplified. So let's say there's a low shared context. Okay, the manager and the subordinate only talk through emails, and the subordinate never really got to know the manager very well. Well, whenever you send an email, or even when you talk to somebody without a lot of visuals, a lot of the context is stripped from your messaging. Okay, especially in email. There's no context in emails. It's just a bunch of data. There's a learning hierarchy, which basically which is something else, which is like another half-hour conversation. But basically, emails is like the second lowest form of communication. It's not very good. It's high in codification, but it sucks for context. So the subordinate is only going to, he will apply the message very literally, obviously, because he has very little context to understand the message. Okay.
Right.
In an ideal, in a healthy cybernetic relationship, in a healthy system, there's a feedback where the manager says, "Okay, subordinate, how did you receive my message, and how are you? How did you hear it? You know, how did you translate it, and what do you think I meant?" Then the manager takes that and alters the message to correct for any problems that the subordinate may have had in understanding the message. That's in a feedback loop. But as we know, in a lot of organizations, communication is one direction. Okay, email blast goes out from, you know, the people on high. Do this, boom, have it done by yesterday. And the only feedback is it's usually some other guy who has a spreadsheet says, "Hey, who didn't do this?" Well, there's no feedback you know, for a very low context, like do this, you know, do X, that's fine. But if you're a manager and you're trying to communicate a very complex message, and you want someone to do something that involves a lot of steps and may need a lot of context, if you don't have context, feedback's pretty important to understand whether or not the guy understood it. And most managers either don't, you know, let's be fair, most managers don't have the time to call and say, hey, subordinate, how are you doing with that task I gave you? All they're waiting for is a report to say, yeah, I did it. You know, or they will send a very low context email saying, this is what I did.
Completed.
So, exactly, completed. Check the block off. We're done. So the last model was a very basic communication medium model. Communication can be broken down into either contextual information or codified information. Like, for instance, pictures. Like, if I gave you a picture of something, is very high context. Now, I can give you a picture of something that may mean something completely different to you because the way that you perceive that picture is different. Like, if I gave you a picture of a kookaburra and you've never seen one before, you may think differently about the kookaburra than I would. You know, I may think that there are annoying little pests that make a lot of noise. You go, oh wow, that's a cute little bird. I'd like to have one. So, when you deal with face to face, it's high context. It's a little more information because now you have feedback. Okay. As a rule of thumb, when you create a strategy, sometimes you want high context information, sometimes you want low context information. Just depends on what's being sent. Okay. Codified information is good for communicating information. Contextual information is good for developing relationships and for developing trust and for allowing people to make decisions without you checking all the time because they understand the context that the decision took place in. Now, with high context comes high trust, and you can see that in the social distance model. So when you have high context with another person, you're going to trust that your message was interpreted correctly. Okay. So.
Okay. And by all means, I don't mean to make you go through the entire thing again, especially if it's excuse me. Sorry about that. If it's recorded and yeah, I can go through the recording.
Okay.
I was just primarily had a couple of questions.
Yeah. Well, I just covered 3 slides in 10 minutes, which I thought was pretty good. But
excellent.
And Larry loves listening to me do this because every once in a while, Larry will spool me up in the chow hall, and I'll pull out the soapbox and talk about this stuff. So Larry's heard this stuff before.
That's why we work 60-hour weeks, so I can use it again.
Yeah, right.
There we go.
Yeah, the rest will basically talk about types of dysfunctional communication that I included just for the team to understand what happens when the communication fails. Okay. Miscommunication and malcommunication. You can listen to the recording once it's posted. Social distance, real quick, deals with the perceived distance from somebody else. If you ever hear someone say, that person seems far from me, this person seems close to me, that's social distance. Okay. Real quick, social distance is asymmetrical. What person A thinks about person B is completely independent from what person B thinks about person A. Over time, they begin to align, but it's not always true, especially when you have people thousands of miles separated from each other. Okay, I've seen this as like, yeah, that guy's a really hard worker, but the hard workers are going, no, that guy's an ass. So, yeah.
Yeah, perception is reality and can be completely different.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So the social network orbit model I talked about, this is about how social distance affects long distance teams. Okay, what happens is when you have high relationship quality, there's a lot of people can relate to each other. But when you have a breakdown in communication, you have a lack of trust and a lack of shared context. You have what is called in-group and out-group tendencies. And what happens is a site will suddenly go and identify with people who have high shared context and high identification and say, yeah, I can trust these people. They're in my in-group. Everybody else is in my out-group. And what usually happens is the manager in this instance usually becomes part of the out-group. Now, so let's say you have a person who is perceived as being the manager's favorite. That person, no matter how great he could be or how well-intentioned he can be, will be viewed as an adversary by the minority group. So as a result, when you have low relationship quality with high social distance, you have conflict. And this has been shown over and over and over again to be true. And this is a byproduct of when we were cavemen or Neanderthals, whatever you want to call it, where we rely on high contextual information to determine who is safe to be in our tribe. Well, our tribal instincts weren't designed for 1,000-mile relationships. It relies context. And the bad thing about long distance, communication breaks down because it strips away context. That is required for teams to trust each other and to have shared identification. So as a result, we become adversaries, just like our Neanderthal spear-chucking descendants.
Okay. Well, and this is where I came in as well.
Awesome. So
now I'm basically back.
Yeah. So I added this because when we create our communication strategy, I don't want to say, okay, we're just going to create a way to communicate. This is the emails that we're going to send out. This is how we're going to do it. This is when they're due. I want to say, okay, well, we need to focus on a strategy that helps the team build relationships. A lot of what Paul was saying was teams don't feel comfortable talking to each other. Well, why is that? We're going to find out. You know, it could be because we have a lot of majority group stuff going on. We could have a lot of in-group, out-group stuff. And if that's the case and the team as a whole has this issue, then we need to design high context information so that the teams have a chance to communicate with each other, learn from each other, and begin to kind of break it down. And this is something that I did not cover earlier. When you view the social network orbit model, okay, you can't see this. It's kind of like a solar system view, okay? The in-group is really close to the sun, out-group is kind of far away. When you have poor relationship quality, the out-group planets, so to speak, are pushed further and further out. The in-group planets become closer and closer in because the local dude, he's trying to protect himself from the majority group. So he's going to get all his allies together. So the minority group begins defending themselves, and then they become closer and closer and closer because they rely on themselves more. The information between those two groups become more and more context rich because they're trying to learn about themselves so they can protect themselves from the big bad wolf.
Okay. And how are we going to go about finding out the information or the answer to that question?
Well, do we need to is one question. I'm going to open that up to the floor. But what we could do is we could do a survey, a very anonymous survey, similar to what I put together, where basically says, hey, look, rate your relationship with your local team and with other sites and with management. And then we compile it all, apply some regression or whatever other tool we want to use, and we can say, yeah, our team has a communication problem. Now, this may not be the road that Paul wants us to go down. Okay.
And that's where you had talked about talking to him to make sure that you were on the correct path.
Correct.
Okay.
Or we may just say, hey, look, let's just create a system that has contextual information that gives people the opportunity to talk. Now, the problem is, if we have a majority culture, people, you could build a bus, but they're not going to hop on it. They're going to be like, okay, great, I got a weekly video conference with the boss, but why the hell do I want to call in with him when I don't even like him? Or they may say, well, I may call in, but I know he's just doing it because he's trying to blow smoke up my ass. So
Interesting.
that can happen.
Okay.
So we could just say, yeah, we're just going to create a vehicle for us to share information and create all this context. But if there is a problem, there's other things that we have to do also.
Right.
It's very difficult. I don't know if we have that bad a problem with our team, being on the long arm of the universe out here for the last
Right.
9 years. I'm isolated from a lot of the politics of other sites. But, as a team, we may decide, yeah, you know what, maybe we should see how the team is. Maybe we should see, and we would make it very, very anonymous. I would recommend we don't say, like, the survey won't say, what site are you a part of? We don't want to do that because that's a really bad way to
Definitely.
cause problems. We would say, in general, everyone's inputs go into it, and then we determine how everyone views, And this is the thing, when I do this with other managers, most managers don't realize they have a problem. Now, eventually they do. And once again, I don't know if we do have a problem. And to be fair, to be honest with you, Paul's been pretty open about this stuff. So either he already may know that there's a problem, or he may be pretty comfortable with his relationships with the other groups, and that's fine.
Right.
And
I haven't seen too much of a problem per se. I definitely have seen the different groupings, but I think a lot of it is primarily simply due to distance and the ability.
Sure.
We don't have the ability to kind of like the solar system model. We can't orbit back in and
Sure.
Renew relationships or get more context. We're kind of perpetually, kind of like you said, you've been out there for 9 years. We're perpetually stuck in the outer edge of the solar system.
Sure. So in that case, in that scenario, we just create the vehicles and then create general encouragements. And there's a way to do it. You design it into your communication methods, and then you solve two problems. It's like our team only has a cold. It's not full blown pneumonia yet, so we can do some small interventions to help out. Or we, and that very well could be the case. We might just say, okay, this is the strategy where we're going to add some contextual communication so people can get the context and the shared identification with the long arm of the galaxy, so that we can start to pull them back into the in-group orbit.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I, as a matter of fact, I just went through a whole bunch of leadership courses for the military, which included a lot of. It didn't have the same terminology per se, but it had the same concepts that I'm seeing here.
Good.
So
good.
Definitely a reinforcement.
And to be, a lot of the research that I've studied, early on, the military was one of the bigger drivers of it. Now, they eventually kind of faltered, went off and did their own thing, but the military early on saw that there was a problem. And they did do a lot of research into, like, deployed units and how they act. So
right.
Nowadays is kind of built off of that previous research. So, all right. Any other questions?
I'm good. I think this is definitely some good information. I'm interested to see what our plan will be, or the results that we'll see as well, I guess.
And I think Zach had a good point. What I'll do, I'll put together what I've done in the past with some examples, if I can find them, and say, this is how I did in the past. Do we want to do this? And you guys may say, you know what? Steps A, B, and C sound good. D, nah. E, sure. F, let's talk about it. And that's great.
Right.
At least we can get the ball rolling. I'll toss some ideas out. I want to let the team move us where we need to go. because you guys have some great ideas. And like Paul even mentioned, there were some things that had been mentioned earlier that he thought might be good for us to bring up, and we can bring it within this context and apply it and see where it leads us. It's all good.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Well, I'm going
Excellent,
to,
Ken.
yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. I'm going to sign off, and sometime tomorrow I'm going to post this on YouTube, and I'll send the link out to everybody with some references, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thank you much.
You're welcome. Take care, bud.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
See, I guess Larry and Travis are still on. Is that Travis? Not Travis. Zach.
Yep.
All right,
Two
man.
stragglers.
Okay, you guys just can't get enough of me. I understand. Take care, guys. Thanks again.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good one.
You too, bud. Bye-bye.